everyone. Thank you for joining us for the 5th live office hour for the MOOC on environmental security and sustaining peace. I'm Carl Brook. I direct international programs at the Environmental Law Institute. Once again, I will serve as a facilitator and offer a few questions as appropriate. I'm here with Richard Matthew. Richard is one of the core faculty for this course. Richard is a professor of international environmental politics in the schools of social ecology and social science at the University of California at Irvine and founding director of the Center for Unconventional Security Affairs. He is also the director of the Blum Center for Poverty Alleviation, a UC-wide initiative. His research focuses on 3 primary areas: the environmental dimensions of conflict and peace building, climate change adaptation in conflict and post-conflict societies, and transnational threat systems. He's done extensive field work in conflict zones in South Asia and East, Central, and West Africa. Today, we'll be answering a mix of questions, some that were submitted by students ahead of today's session, and some that we are receiving from you live. We'll do our best to cover all of them. If we don't get to them, we encourage you to post your questions in the office hours and other discussion groups. Before we start with the questions, Richard, maybe you'd like to say a little bit more about yourself and your background?
Well, you've covered everything pretty well, Carl. I think the relevant to this is I have had the pleasure of serving on a large number of UN missions in different countries, including Rwanda, Congo, and Sierra Leone, as part of the peace building efforts there. And that's been a very important part of my activity over the past 15, 20 years.
So apropos of that research, I wonder if you might be able to say what some of the key takeaways have been from some of your recent research in conflict-affected countries.
I mean, I think that one of the clearest takeaways to me is that the general premise that environmental factors, natural resource issues, climate stresses of different types, the fact that the idea that they would impact the conflict cycle, that they might contribute to the onset of conflict or become embroiled during the conflict in different ways or be crucial to the post-conflict period, tends to resonate very positively among people who live in those conditions. So while academics may be quite divided and be searching for that compelling case study, that compelling statistical evidence of this causal relationship, on the ground, it makes sense to lots and lots of people. And they have lots of rich personal stories of how the coincidence of conflict and disasters have affected them, how the gnawing pressure of drought or heat wave or something contributed to volatility, how important it is in terms of their ability to look forward and never trust the government or the world again, how important it is that the mining sector or agriculture be the focus of considerable reform and transparency. This makes a lot of sense to many, many people. So that's one thing that I think is important. We have to remember to keep ourselves listening to the perspectives and experience of people living through this type of situation.
You mentioned climate change and climate factors. I'd like to get to that in a moment, but there's another question. Somebody asked about, in a post-conflict setting, how are environmental management priorities established? And I'd be curious also to the extent that you're able to speak to that in conflict-affected settings while conflict's still going on. With all the other priorities, how do you focus attention on environmental issues?
I mean, I think, so first of all, my experience is limited to a series of cases that I've been involved in. And I would say that typically it much depends on what is in place in the conflict-affected country. So a country that, I'll take Sierra Leone as an example, where you really did not have an environmental protection agency, you didn't have an environmental ministry sort of up and running at the end of the war. There was heavy reliance on sort of scientific evidence generated by the UN and so on. And I think that the role of UNEP in helping people understand what has happened during the war, what are some of the things that look really critical in terms of immediate priorities is very important. in my experience, this type of activity is done very, very carefully in consultation with people throughout the country. So there's a lot of time spent, in focus groups and interviewing people and meeting the conservation community, meeting people who make their living in terms of agriculture or mining, spending time with these people to sort of, in an iterative process to sort of figure out what's the situation with water, what's the situation with agriculture, what's the situation with the fisheries, with the mines, and this slowly allows priorities to come into focus. So I think it's really a combination of UN and other peace building entities, local communities, the expertise that exists in the country, whatever level of expertise that is. And that information, the more sort of scientifically based it is, the more succinct it is, the more people who have participated in generating it, the more likely it is to be taken seriously in the broader discussions that generate sort of the national plans for reconstruction and identify priorities. In my experience, it's not hard to make the case that restoring water or making sure that we protect soil or taking pressure off maybe sand that's been used for reconstruction. It's not difficult to make the case. There's lots of other priorities going on, and sometimes you don't always the environmental issue is sometimes put aside for a little while. But I think that it gets more and more attention, and people want to do the most sustainable thing if that's viable. But it really is a sort of a consultation process involving lots of different types of expertise.
Thank you. I wonder if we might shift now to climate change, which was a topic of a number of the chapters, and you have particular expertise in. Somebody asked, where do you see conflict-affected countries making the most progress in climate change adaptation and mitigation? Where do you hope these efforts will progress over the next decade or so?
Wonderful question. I think that, and one thing I should just say, sort of, and as a preface to answering any of these questions, is that a lot of studies that have been done and sort of research, case studies and statistical research are important inputs into figuring out what's going on, as well as the experience of people in the field, people living through these circumstances. A lot of them are not strictly comparable. So people are using different understandings of conflict affected and different understandings of fragile, and different understandings of what a climate stress is or a climate adaptation is. So it isn't sort of like we can say the whole body of evidence tells us a very clear story. But what I do think is compelling is research that suggests that overall, those countries that are most vulnerable to climate impacts, those countries that are most vulnerable are, and ISD released a report 3 years ago that looked at 15 of the world's most vulnerable countries, and they correlate very highly to countries that are also conflict affected, are making progress across a number of fronts. It's not very quick progress, it's slow progress. But they're moving to, say, in the agricultural sector, to drought-resistant seeds. They're moving to better irrigation practices. They're moving to better protection of soils and water. They're moving towards better storage systems and better transportation systems. In areas like energy, they fully recognize the value of diversifying. In what else? Areas like fisheries, we're seeing a general slow movement towards, thinking about how to manage climate stress. At the same time, and DFID, I think it was DFID that released a report 2 years ago. At the same time, those countries that are most vulnerable to conflict are also experiencing some of the heaviest early impacts. They're the ones where we see the long drought. They're the ones where we see the massive uncontrolled, floods and the really incredibly damaging heat waves and so on. So it's a mixed story, isn't it? We're seeing some progress. People are aware of what needs to be done in many ways, and they're making steps in those directions, but they're not outrunning the pace of the impacts, I don't think. So I think that we're still seeing, the impacts of drought and the related things like disease and so on are still sort of overall mounting in many of the countries like, DRC or Somalia or Central African Republic, Sudan, those sorts of countries. So they're fighting the battle, but they're not getting ahead of the curve at this point.
I'm wondering if you see a difference between adaptation and mitigation efforts. A lot of what you're talking about focus more on the adaptation side, trying to blunt the effects of climate-related stressors.
I mean, I think that when there are vehicles that they can tap into to preserve forests or to diversify energy, there's lots of willingness to do that. So I think that there's no hesitation, if it's technically and financially feasible, to integrate mitigation measures into reconstruction and resilience building. I think it's often a difficult challenge to do this. But I think that there are definitely, again, we see the same mixed picture of people, and some, I think some good cases of people, and Liberia is an example of it, with very well-intended and sustainable sort of ambitions regarding, say, forestry and forest management, but challenges really implementing those and getting them to work fully, and lots of steps back as well as steps forward. So I think that we're seeing interest in both mitigation and adaptation, but I don't think that. I think that there are financial and technical constraints which are considerable in these areas.
It seems like one of the primary mitigation efforts that I've seen is not necessarily a mitigation. It's not sold as mitigation for the country. It's more sold as a political, as an economic opportunity for countries to capitalize on the demand for biofuels, which is in a lot of conflict-affected countries. You see what are often referred to as land grabs everywhere from Liberia and Sierra Leone to South Sudan and Mindanao, where large biofuel companies are coming in and planting large plantations, whether it's jatropha or palm oil or something else.
I agree. I think there is. We do see a fair amount of that. My sense is that some of these land grabs, some of these investments, are proving quite challenging to manage. So the terms are often unfavorable to the country, the conflict country. Often the government is required to ensure the priority access to water and to provide security and these sorts of things. But on a day-to-day basis, they can be very expensive to manage. So I think they're sort of potentially they're potentially damaging to both sides. In other words, they take land out of the system, but at the same time, they're really hard to manage and expensive to manage, and there's lots of ways they can break down and fail. So I haven't seen many examples that look sustainable and mutually beneficial, but I have seen things that look like they're causing problems to both parties or all parties.
Wonder if you could talk a little bit about a project or research that you've worked on that improved a community's ability to cope with environmental shocks and or climate change.
Absolutely. I mean, one of our biggest projects, I think an area in which we've invested a lot of time, is in very, very high resolution modeling of extreme event risk, and especially flood risk. And we developed these models very closely with communities. The objective is that they're trusted, that they're answering the questions that they need to answer, which are often questions of, how do we maintain access to where we're employed? How do we evacuate our children? How do we protect, fresh water supplies? How do we protect food? These sorts of very practical questions. So we've been developing these models in a number of places, Mexico, Paraguay, Malawi, and so on. And it's been really, over the last couple of years, our ability to bring advanced computational modeling that uses satellite imagery and high-resolution drone imagery that we collect, and then local knowledge and understanding, to bring these together in a way which is easy to use and understandable, has made it much easier for people to make decisions about green infrastructure, or about drainage systems, or about whether it makes how to grade a road, whether it should be fully paved or not fully paved. And we're running these local decisions through our model. And people are saying, okay, in that case, we'll get our community together to build a wall over here because it makes a lot of sense. What we found in the past where it was a sort of hit and miss effort. People would rally together to try and say mitigate or reduce risk to something like flooding. But it was very difficult to anticipate where water would flow the next flood. And so we've sort of brought another tool into the mix. And although at this point, it requires a fair amount of time to get to know the community, to build their perspective, their concerns, their knowledge into the model. Each time we do it, it's easier and sort of more effective. So I think we're very excited about the possibility of mapping, modeling, visualization tools to be useful to a very wide range of people, including people in the front lines of climate impacts, people with very few other resources to mobilize.
Could you talk a little bit about both the scale at which you're doing this and any observations on that, if that's the community level, the subnational level, or the national level, and how do you address the capacity gaps? Is this something that you have to plan in most cases, that part of the process is building capacity, and that's not just the computers but the soft side? Or, I mean, could you talk about both the scale and the capacity aspects of this work?
Sure. I mean, in principle, you can work on any scale. One thing that has to be ascertained quickly is what level of resolution, how much data are you going to be processing? So when we work and we work often at a fairly small community scale, where maybe there's extreme vulnerability to flooding and so on. So maybe an area that's 15 kilometers by 15 kilometers, something like this. We have to think about what area do you need to model to understand, say, water dynamics. What resolution do you need to get these to support the sort of decisions that have to be made there? The lower the resolution, the easier it is to produce the model, the easier it is to work it on an iPad or a phone and so on. The more data you have to use, the bigger the challenge, right? So it's a question of finding that resolution, which is accessible, but reliable and useful. And it isn't the same for every situation, right? So it sort of varies. At different scales, often the resolution doesn't need to be nearly as sharp. If people are saying, we get, take for example, the camps that are appearing in Bangladesh right now. They're in a fairly concentrated area. I think it's about 20 square kilometers, or 20 by 20 kilometers, something like this. A very hilly area. And the cyclones and floods are destroying huge numbers of buildings, contaminating water, destroying, sanitation systems and so on. For something like that, you probably need very fine resolution, so that people can look and say, I can dig a ditch right here, I can build a wall right here to start to manage flooding, manage the cyclone impacts effectively for this little region. As you get out, it gets coarser, but the decisions are a different category of decision. And they may be more planning and policy decisions. They may be more, general disaster response decisions. So you are playing with those scales. I think at the forefront for us are always what's the computational capacity, what's the computing capacity, what are the things, what are the assets they can bring to bear? Is it time? Is it labor? What do they have? Because that has to be built into the model. The model is not very useful if it can only generate answers that are not operable. So it's a lot of getting to know the situation, but we're really trying to make this available, at a low bandwidth, high resolution, but accessible to everyone. This is what we're working towards.
So do you run multiple scenarios, and then this is essentially a decision support tool where it's a question of, do we put them here? Do we put them there? Do we draw more water? Do we draw less water? So you're kind of running different scenarios, and that is used to inform decisions, or do you tend to have like one map that you work off of?
No, we have a base map of a very high resolution of the topography. But then we can do something like run fire or drought or water through that base map. people sometimes, local communities sometimes ask questions that we had never thought of. For example, from the perspective of somebody who studies hydrology, the amount of surface water during a major rain event is not usually so important as how quickly it rains and where it drains. But we found communities that have said to us, we really want to know the extent of surface water. They have their own reasons for that. So we can say, okay, we can model that. We can get rainfall information. Obviously, you run let's say we're talking about flooding. You run the many scenarios. It depends, both to backcast to see how high your level of agreement is with actual events, and then because if you take something like sea level rise, there's a whole broad range of possible sea level rise scenarios. So we will run through a large number of them. Sometimes we run hundreds and hundreds of scenarios for a variety of purposes. It depends what ultimately people are trying to get information about. I'll give you an example. We work in a canyon community that's highly vulnerable to extreme flood events. And these flood events kill large numbers of people. They're very, very destructive. So we ran the model with what happens if they have one culvert which drains the entire area. We run models of, could you increase culvert size? What would happen? If you kept the culverts always clean, what would happen? Under different conditions of climate stress, what could happen? Where could you build ditches? You have to run lots of different scenarios depending on what the local community is trying to resolve or build resilience in the face of.
The student just asked a follow-on question to that. What are the variables you use for these scenarios? Political, social, economic, and would you select the best scenario, the worst scenario? How does the selection work?
So that's a really tough question, and I'll tell you, if you think of something fairly straightforward like sea level rise, so models work on all sorts of different projections of sea level rise. The differences are enormous, right? So a model might look at the potential for sea level rise from sort of inches to 30 or 40 feet and assign different probabilities. Now, what are you prepared to live with? If you look at something like the California coast, the mean projections of sea level rise over the next 50, 100 years are very, very low, but the extremes are extremely high. The mean projections, if that's what happens, would cause very little damage to most of California. The extremes would be devastating to one of the largest economies in the world. So it is very difficult to figure out exactly, what data you use. We try to run the best scientific data through and the projections that are generated locally or by the UN or by whoever, to give us a range of things. When it comes to other information, we tend to work with a range of community leaders and sort of neighborhood groups to help understand what the likely sort of next phase of development is going to be in the area. What's happening? What is cropping up? What are the trends there in terms of population, urban development, transportation development? So we try and get our best possible sense, but there isn't always full agreement. This is where we're headed economically and in terms of demographics and in terms of infrastructure. So you have to play with a number of scenarios. I think part of the challenges is whether it makes sense to work with sort of means or whether it makes sense to work with extremes, and I think that varies from case to case.
Could you also talk about some of the other non-environmental variables that you might be looking at? They might be political or social or economic variables or choices to be made.
Mm-hmm. So I mean, I think that I'm not. So in terms of modeling, say risk to climate stresses,
or it could be the risk to climate stresses, or just this decision support tool that you've used in different contexts. Are you looking at are we going to develop this land, or are we going to keep it for resilient, for like a buffer zone or something like that?
So we're modeling several different layers of information now. We have topographical information, and then we look at urban expansion, urban development, those sorts of, how is and there's sort of, you can build on the trajectory of what's happened over the past 20, 30 years, or you can work with city plans that, this is what we're going to do. We look at the economics of the area. How is it developing? In what way? Is this moving towards manufacturing or tourism or what? And so we integrate sort of the regional economy, the development, urban development, the core physical topography. We model all of those things together. We also use health data. So we can look at, where during extreme events, different types of health problems have popped up. We can then correlate all of that with, say, basic hydrology or projections of flooding. And sort of say, okay, here's where water is likely to pool. If you're building critical infrastructure over here, this is going to be a huge problem for you. Or here's where it'll be very hard for water to drain. This is going to be a major health hazard. Or here's where right now you've got nice drainage, but if you pave this area, what we imagine is you're going to speed up the flooding and it's going to move into this direction, which is where you're building lots of housing. So we play with all of those things. There's many more layers of information that could be integrated, but there's some computational challenges each time. So basically we're working on urban development, physical topography, extreme events, flood, fire, drought, and economic and health data. Integrate those.
We have two more somewhat related questions on climate change. One is, according to the UN, the world population for 2050 will be 9.7 billion people, and it is expected that 70% of these people will live in cities. How do you focus efforts to mitigate and adapt the world to climate change? The second question, somewhat related, says, there's a global trend at looking at climate change as something inevitable and disastrous, which demands many resources and efforts that will be lost due to the strong climate stress. What are your thoughts on this perspective?
I mean, I think on the first question, what we do know is that, and the millennial assessment of 2000 made this very clear, is that the world has chosen to continue to aggressively populate its coastline. Urban coastal development around the world is far, far faster than interior urban development. So even though the coastlines around the world, whether it's Africa or South Asia or Southeast Asia or South America, wherever we're seeing this, we're seeing growing pressures. People move there because of the climate, the water access, transportation, whatever the reasons are. And those are the areas which are also, at the forefront of vulnerability to floods and to sea level rise and to cyclones and to these sorts of things. So we are allowing more and more people to move into, in a sense, the more fragile parts of the planet at a very alarming rate. And it doesn't appear that knowledge that people are moving into areas that are going to be vulnerable is slowing down the movement of people. So we do have a bit of a problem here. And we also know that we've also identified that in much of the world, there's a sequence of climate impacts. So drought tends to end with flooding. Flooding tends to, after drought, lead to mudslides. Before it goes, drought, fire, flooding, mudslides. So we know that if you move people into these fragile areas, they are going to be vulnerable to flooding, to mudslides, to fires, to drought, to all these sorts of things happening. How do we change that? I think there is so much capacity to think carefully about coastal urban development and to start to, sort of redirect it. I'm not saying stop it, but redirect it so that we try to encourage the next generation of development there to be far more resilient than it currently is. But I do think that the trends are problematic. The continuing movement of people into these very fragile parts of the planet, objectively, it doesn't make a huge amount of sense, but it is a situation that doesn't look like it's about to slow down at all. On the other question, and just maybe you could just refresh my memory about the second question. That's about the climate change is inevitable.
That there's a trend to looking at climate change as something inevitable and disastrous, which demands many resources, efforts that will be lost due to the strong climate stress. So they're asking, what are your thoughts on this perspective? Do you agree or not?
I would say that based on the work that we are doing, we find that the situation is much more complicated than that. So that climate change is going to have mixed impacts. There are definitely set sequences of relationships. If you get drought leading to flood, leading to mudslide, or drought leading to fire, leading to flood, and so on, these are enormously costly events, very difficult often to recover from, and so on. But I think that as we move forward, we discovered that there's a lot happening, and so it is very difficult to say what sea level rise is going to look like over the next 50 or 100 years, and to predict with great accuracy which coastal areas are really going to lose beaches, lose salt marshes, experiencing more flooding. So much goes on to determine. It's sort of a little bit like conflict itself. A lot depends on the interaction between freshwater and saltwater systems, and development decisions that are made, and the ability of people to be prepared, to be warned, to take aggressive action. It isn't clear to me that we should just predict a uniform global disaster. It is clear to me that there are areas that are going to suffer egregiously over the next few decades, short of doing something for them. And there are areas that probably have more time, and the complex relationships between those parts of the world that are going to be battered by drought and flood and those parts that are not, is very difficult to model and predict. But I would say, on the whole, we have to make decisions about how we manage what from a scientific perspective is a complex set of probabilities and a very complicated world in which it would be wonderful to have simple associations and clear sequences, but we don't really get that. So we have to deal with a world with a lot of uncertainty. And I would say climate change is very real, but I would be very suspicious of projections that look 40 or 50 years into the future as doctrinal. I would say they're suggestive of things that may occur under certain conditions, which are almost certainly turbulent and in flux.
The student asked a question about one of your previous statements, but I think it ties in very nicely here. It's an interesting dilemma, they say. Plan for means or extremes? Do local communities usually have a preference?
Oh, that's a great question. And I'll tell you what, in our experience, there's a tendency probably to plan for means for a number of reasons. First of all, it's much cheaper. The means in something like sea level rise are in many parts of the world quite low for the next few decades. So adding a little bit of to a seawall, or changing your building codes a little bit, or making it easier to build quick berms, or whatever your defense is, that's fairly cheap and affordable if you work with means. And we find that where there's lots of investment, wealthy investment, with short-term horizons, so where you have valuable real estate, but people are expecting to extract profit in a few years, they're not interested in extremes. They're not interested in thinking about extremes when it comes to building and urban development. We find very poor communities also, they're not really looking at extremes. They're looking at what's the most likely scenario that they're going to face in the short term. And how do they protect themselves? How do they make sure they have access to their jobs? How do they make sure that they can evacuate or reduce the likelihood of a cholera outbreak, or protect their children under realistic scenarios that are the ones they're most likely to experience? So I would say that there's a sort of political and economic bias towards the means right now, even though I would say the conservation community tends to talk more about the extremes.
Somebody asked about whether there was any experience with affirmative action, giving quotas to the poorest on the boards of resources and conflict management.
Well,
the thought to me, I'm happy to jump in here, or if you have thoughts on this.
I mean, my experience is clearly in some post-conflict countries. Rwanda is a good example. There's been tremendous effort to have representation, but it's mitigated by also a desire to have a small group of people control or steer outcomes and outputs and outcomes in a certain direction. So my experience is it's a bit of a mixed bag, but I think you probably know more than I do about this.
Well, to me, it's the framing is interesting, because I think in a lot of countries in the post-conflict period, as you were describing, there's an effort to reform management of the resources. There often are boards, sometimes advisory boards, sometimes decision-making boards set up to guide the decisions. And they don't necessarily refer to it as the poorest people, but you'll have representations of historically marginalized people. So women, indigenous peoples, civil society, user groups. Again, sometimes these are advisory, sometimes they have more power, sometimes they're advisory, but they can really apply political pressure if there's corruption or bad decisions. So it does feel like, at least in certain resources in certain countries, that those sorts of boards are making movements in that direction, but maybe not systemically. What I don't know is whether this applies. I see it a lot in forestry, and some in mining, some in land, but I don't know if it applies more in certain resources than others.
I mean, I think it's a good question, and I haven't seen a study that assesses this around the world, so it's sort of anecdotal evidence. But I certainly see that in post-conflict situations, there's an effort to be inclusive and to ensure that underrepresented communities, whether they're indigenous people, whether it's women, are included in some capacity. However, I think that this inclusion doesn't necessarily come with the political weight and capacity to really steer outputs and outcomes. So I think it's a step in the right direction. I'm not sure we're seeing it change the trajectory of economies and political systems.
And I think the interesting question there is, when does it change the outcomes and why? Because we're seeing efforts to do this, and sometimes it leads to change, sometimes not the change that you're hoping for. And I think it's a really interesting question about when does it and why does it, or why it does not.
No, absolutely. It's a fascinating question. I think that again, we see in parts of South America the inclusion of local communities and indigenous peoples in forest management. It seems to me that it's still a bit early to assess the long-term outcomes of this and whether this has led to more sustainable practices, more equitable distribution of natural, resource wealth, these sorts of things, more shared mitigation of risk and so on, improved health conditions. But I think that we're seeing the movement in these directions in areas like water management, forestry management. Maybe I'm not as familiar with progress in the mining sector. I know there has been lip service. I'm not as aware of real progress, but I do think there are reasons to be. There are rays of light here and there. I just haven't seen. I don't think we have enough time to make authoritative statements about the outcome, the broader outcome, the social impacts, the transformative, sort of effects of this type of inclusion.
Going to one of the students' questions asking about Liberia. Given such a tumultuous recent history, what's the state of Liberia's natural resources today?
Now, again, I think that you may have as good a sense of this as I certainly think that we know that there have been a tremendous effort, and President Johnson Sirleaf certainly moved things in a direction of of more sustainable forest management, of higher levels of transparency, not just in the mining sector, but across the board in natural resources, of more inclusion. People were pushed out of all sorts of contracts and agreements that had been formed during the conflict periods or before the conflict periods. At the same time, recent assessments suggest that the on-the-ground impact of this still leaves much improvement to be made. We're still seeing lots of illegal activity, still lots of dissatisfaction with especially land tenure reform and these sorts of things. So I think that at one level, we're seeing movement towards transparency, inclusion, reform, sustainability, but I don't think that has really translated into far more sustainable practices or far better land tenure agreements than what existed in the past. I just think that the platform is in place for progress over the next couple of decades if it can be financed and if the political will is able to sort of steer the ship forward. That's my sense of Liberia, but you've been there, I think, more recently.
Yeah, I was just there 2 months ago, and what you said is, I think, is a good description. The big thing that is really going on right now is a political struggle over who owns the land.
Yeah.
That the customary tenure is there has been some recognition of it, but it's not what a lot of advocates want. There has been a Land Rights Act pending before Parliament since 2014, and it would reallocate a lot of the land to the communities, and this would apply primarily to land, but it could also have a profound effect on forestry resources. So that's where what you were describing, I think, is spot on. That there were a lot of governance reforms in terms of the institutions and the processes and participation and transparency, empowering civil society. The change of the local rights to the resources, that's still very much in flux. There was the recent, the 2009 Community Forestry Law, and then the implementing regulations for that. But the land law is still pending. So I think that is something that is an area of development. The other thing that I think is maybe a little less promising or a little more discouraging is the developments around oil and gas. There's thought to be offshore reserves. There were payments made for exploration, though I don't think they've proven the reserves. And there have been recent accusations, a report that came out just this last week by Global Witness making accusations of corruption in some of those payments. And so I think that's still in flux, and I would say in development. And one thing that seems that Liberia has had a history of, since the end of the war, you see a lot of developments, some backsliding, responses, developments, backsliding. It's not a unidirectional process, but there's been the general arc has been very positive. There's a new president of the country as of earlier this year. He has a pro-poor platform. What that translates to in practice remains to be seen.
I would just add one thing to that, and that is that I think it remains the case that in spite of lots of compelling rhetoric about things like land reform, overall, what we have seen last year, the year before, the year before, stretching back decades, has been the continuing concentration of wealth in smaller and smaller number of hands. And wealth is not just land, it's not just property, it's technology, it's other forms of capital. Land is part of it. So the global trend is really leaving more and more people with less and less wealth in comparison to the growth of the global economy. So the reforms may make dents in a community here or a region there. But I think overall we face a really alarming trend of a small group of people in the world who have really managed to find a way to consolidate wealth into their own hands and much income as well. A huge group who really have very little wealth, whether it's land or other forms of capital. They have very, very little. And I think we're talking about, 1 out of 2 people are essentially, from a wealth perspective, in absolute condition of poverty. So the trends, the big global trends, are highly discouraging on this front. And I think if we can find little glimmers of hope in this community or that community, that's wonderful. I think that the broad trends are alarming, and we need to try and redirect those a little bit. That's something easy to do.
Along those lines, Michael Clare had a book entitled "The Race for What's Left." Are you familiar with the book?
I'm not familiar with the book, but it sounds like a Michael Clare title.
It basically is making the argument that property rights to minerals, timber, agricultural land, all the resources, property rights in developed countries are all divvied up, and the race now is for what's left, and that's in developing countries and especially countries emerging from conflict.
I mean, I think that there's, I think that what's left, if what's left includes the enormous natural resource wealth of the Arctic region, then the race for that is in high gear. And it creates a mixed incentive to stop global warming, because we know that a little more global warming will liberate an enormous amount of wealth for a very small number of countries that are, for the most part, already at the top of the heap. So that race is if he includes that race, I think that we already know how that ends, because the bulk of the world has no way of making a claim on that wealth. And that's enormous. I think that it's certainly true that within many of these countries, property, things that are more or less stable and distributed. So there's probably a race for the couple of $1 trillion in Afghanistan's minerals and so on and so forth. But I look at the big picture, and I think that the wealth that the world has in the oceans, in the Arctic, in these areas is enormous, and that race is largely being won already by the handful of richest countries in the world.
The student just submitted a question on your earlier comments. What are the timeframes that you base plans on? And if there are different scales, long-term, short-term, what activities or measures are planned for which period?
I mean, from a climate sort of adaptation mitigation perspective, we definitely, and we model in accordance with short and medium and long-term planning and so on. And we're trying to figure out, can you make short-term decisions that are almost always guaranteed to be the ones that support the medium-term and long-term decisions, plans that will have to be made? Or is there friction between different timescales? And in a post-conflict situation, that's a very difficult challenge. So when you're trying to rebuild infrastructure and get things moving quickly, in the short term, to house people, to get them back to work, to get them in shelter, to get them water, to get them energy, but you're also thinking about what the country is going to be facing 20 years down the road or 50 years down the road. There's a lot of trade-offs and uncertainty and difficulties doing that. So even if you're in a very wealthy place, it's a tough thing to reconcile. But in a place where the needs are acute and urgent and immediate, it is, I think, easy to discount the future a little bit and to take care of immediate priorities and hope that things will work out going, in 20 years. And we see that now we have enough evidence to suggest that that type of planning can really fail on people. And there, you solve some problems quickly, but unless you're solving the medium-term challenges as well, you face all sorts of problems in the not-too-distant future. I do think it's really difficult. I think that with a very poor local community, there's a tendency to have a short-term perspective because they have immediate needs. It's the next cyclone, the next monsoon. How do they prepare for that? And the needs are immediate because their homes were destroyed in the last one, or they lost their job, or the transportation infrastructure was closed in the last one. So it's very immediate. But I think that, in an ideal world, we'd constantly be saying, can we make decisions that solve those immediate needs in ways that contribute to the longer term aspirations that the same people probably have. It's just they don't have the resources necessary to do them all. And keep open the possibility that new information will require that we change direction a little bit, over the course of a decade or two. Because a decade now is quite a long period of time in terms of how rapidly urban expansion can change the contours of a place. It's quite remarkable how different, say, flood dynamics are, today from what they were 10 years ago, and how that might change 10 years hence.
Can you talk about that for a moment? The differences that you've seen, say, over the last 10 years?
Sure. I think so typically what you get is situations where, and it's probably more acute in those areas that are growing most quickly, and that's, I think, right now the African coastline, African coastal cities, and so on. But it's acute everywhere. Within 10 years, you can do an awful lot of paving, a lot of land reconfiguring, build a lot of infrastructure, right? And everything that you do is going to affect hydrological dynamics. Everything you do, because water basically responds to, fundamental laws of physics. It's gravity. It's the most fundamental laws determine where water is going to go and what it's going to take with it, and whether it's going to pick up, earth and mud, whether it's going to move quickly or slowly, and so on. So what we're discovering is that you run flood through an urban space 10 years ago, and today it will look very, very different because so much more paving has taken place. So new buildings are in place. All sorts of changes have occurred in very compressed timeframes. That makes it very difficult, by the way, for people who are basing their risk management on personal experience to stay ahead of the curve, because their last experience is probably less and less relevant if the world around them is changing as rapidly as it often is. So I think that I would say for us, most urban development that we're looking at, the risks are changing in a matter of years. And that's from, whether it's Los Angeles or whether it's La Paz, Mexico, or you name the city, the risks are changing quickly because things like paving and so on have such a dynamic impact on what water does and can do.
Shifting gears, a student asks, Carl discusses in his lecture that most of the conflicts that we are seeing in the world are non-international armed conflicts. Do you expect this to change? Do you think that we'll see more international armed conflicts in the future? And I realize this is not necessarily a lecture you delivered, but wonder if you have thoughts on this.
I mean, I think that it is. There was a sort of era. There was a point in time when governments declared wars and sent national armies across their borders to wage these wars, and those wars tended to end with international agreements and payments and so on. I think that really after World War II, we saw a movement in a couple of directions. First, away from these big international wars. So there was this movement towards more civil wars And the reasons, they're disputed. Was it because of the rapid pace of decolonization and the struggles for control in many countries? Was it because of the sort of invisible meddling related to the Cold War rivalry between the Soviet Union and the US? There are lots of different things going on. But in that Cold War period, there was very little incentive to create an international war that would bring big alliances into confrontation, and a lot of incentive to send advisors or to support, rebels or to do things. We have this pattern of wars that are in some sense internationalized, but not explicitly, not by name, not through declarations, but yes, through funding. I can't imagine any war which doesn't have strong international dimension. Arms move in and out, resources move in and out, people move in and out, training takes place in one part of the world and people are moved to another part. There's an internationalization of violent conflict, but it's a very different form than what it was, in the first half of the 20th century. And I don't think anything is just purely indigenous or native. I think that everybody's relying on relationships with the rest of the world for training and arms and funds and whatever it is. So, and I don't know, I don't have my own, I'm not committed to one interpretation, but certainly the rivalry between the US and the USSR around the world meant that there was meddling in very, very large number of countries. It was very intense, high stakes meddling, which nobody owned up to in a sense. So I think that we're still sort of, even though the Cold War is over, we're still trapped in a world in which there's lots of meddling, but not many formal declarations of one country going to war against another.
It also seems that in the last few years, there's been a rise of what's sometimes referred to as the never-ending conflicts, where one side, it's very asymmetric. It's not just a civil war, because in many cases, the people who are fighting them don't necessarily have a particular aim of overthrowing the government, or it's so far removed, but they still fight, often ideological, sometimes wrapped up in the war on terror. But there's a very different set of conflicts that we're seeing. And it's not that familiar.
I agree, and I think that it's sort of reminiscent of medieval world when different units were linked by blood ties and marriages, and the wars would go on and on for decades and decades. And whether it's Afghanistan or Colombia or you name it, we're seeing these multi-decade things which change complexion. They involve this at first, and then they shift to this, and they become about something else. It's drugs, and then it's minerals, and then it's indigenous rights, and it just sort of shifts along. But these wars sort of are almost chronic to some areas and regions of the world. I don't know if Colombia gives us a reason to hope that even very intractable wars can come to an end. But I do know that there's been lots of despair expressed about the challenges of bringing peace to Afghanistan and the challenges of bringing peace to parts of the Middle East, and the challenges of bringing peace to parts of Western Africa and so on, or areas like Sudan and South Sudan. It's very difficult to do this. So I think you're right. We're seeing a type of conflict that nobody either is willing to invest enough in to really transform, or that keeps having life breathed into it from a new direction. And that's terribly challenging.
I'd like to end on maybe a more optimistic note, and adapt a question that somebody asked beforehand. Resilience is an increasingly popular buzzword, and they're curious about how, in your work, have you measured and tracked resilience? I'm interested in whether resilience, which I often see now in the context of resilience to climate change, if resilience might be a useful framework not only for climate change and environmental management, but also for conflict, resilience to conflict, resilience in the face of conflict, resilience, building resilience after conflict, but the possibility of resilience as a framework for the economic and environmental and social side, but also for the conflict side.
I mean, I think that, I guess resilience is a big term. I understand it to refer to sort of, the ability to withstand or survive or recover from some big trauma. And I think that there's mixed messages there. On the one hand, there's an awful lot of ingenuity in the world. There's an awful lot of capacity at the human level to be quite remarkably resilient. And I'm amazed by the different ways this plays out around the world. And I think that we see all sorts of interesting innovations that are allowing people to weather, some pretty brutal trauma. At the same time, at a global scale, resilience in the situations we're talking about, conflict areas that have experienced violent conflict or disaster, is partially shaped by what the world community, the donor community, is prepared to do. And that varies enormously, right? So, there's a lot of well-intentioned sort of activity and support. In my experience, it often comes with sort of strings attached. It often doesn't quite align with local priorities. It often can, what's there one day can disappear too soon, and so on. So we have so insofar as we believe that the world has a responsibility, a sort of, R2P responsibility to help places that have been, struggling under violent conflict or disaster, we're not particularly good at delivering that support in a way which builds resilience. If we look at, can people process threat and risk and make smart decisions to make themselves a little bit better off, I think we're seeing lots of micro level signs of optimism, but really macro level signs of optimism. I think we're seeing a sort of, we're losing at the big fight, but we're winning many of the small battles.
I was trying to be optimistic here. But it's interesting because you were also saying at the outset that a lot of the countries that are affected by conflict are projected to be the most vulnerable to climate change.
Yeah,
so it seems like there might be some opportunities for building, is there a way to integrate the peace building and conflict dimensions into the resilience frameworks that we've been developing more in the environmental and sustainable development sphere?
I think there absolutely is, and I think that that's an area where we're discovering that resilience is not always very expensive, but inexpensive resilience building requires a fairly high resolution knowledge of local conditions and assets and risks. So this is not a situation in which a broad brush has tremendous impact. This is a situation where the more we know local things, the more easy we discover it is to build resilience at that level. I think that to me is an interesting and potentially very promising finding, because we now maybe have the computing technology to look at the world at a very high level of resolution. And I think many problems become more tractable when they become more local. And you can sort of imagine that if we were able to move aggressively along this front, the sort of on the ground local community front, that might be our best shot at larger scale transformation. But I think there is some grounds to be optimistic, because I do think there's some very exciting things and very exciting opportunities at a local scale. I don't know whether they will build up to global resilience, but I think that the potential for that to happen it's a real potential.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Richard Matthew. And I think we've come to the end of our office hour. Any final words?
My pleasure. I mean, I'm so delighted that people have decided to take this MOOC, because I do think that it's covering, it's bringing together two tremendously important areas of sort of global concern. How environment, climate change, natural resources, and the human propensity, the propensity of social systems to break down and to engage in violence, how those interact. And I think that the story that comes out of this work is that there's an awful lot of good that could be done. And the better we understand it, the easier it is to do that good. So I'm delighted to be part of this. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.